You're listening to the ASQ podcast for a transformational approach to life and leadership, blending soul wisdom with modern insight to create outer impact.
Dr. Doug, thank you so much for being here with us this morning, your evening time. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing fine, Omar, and I smile about the doctor. You know, the only reason I do that, my last name is Gulbrandsen,
Mhm.
and no one can pronounce it. And so when I've been at a bunch of network meetings and so forth, and large ones, everybody calls me every name but what my real name is. And finally, someone came up to me and they said, "You know what? You're a doctor. Just go by Dr. Doug." And so that's what I did. So, do I have anything about that? No. Call me Doug. That's perfectly fine.
Mhm. No, but it's awesome. Like we were a guest, we will be a guest on your podcast, but it was so awesome in the way that you conversated and the points that we touched that I felt compelled to say, "Hey, you have time for being a guest on our podcast? I would love to have you." And you say, "Absolutely." I think about it, and you thought about it, and you get back to us. So I'm very excited. We always start our podcast with the customary question, right? Where were you pitched? And we could talk about this because we have a different perspectives, but we're arriving at the same conclusion, right? Tell us about that. Where were you pitched? Where did the universe place you on Earth?
Okay, so I was born in Missoula, Montana.
Oh, right.
And yeah, my dad was a university professor. And at the time, I think just starting out to some degree. So he was in Montana. I was born there, lasted a few years there. And then we moved to a number of different places, ultimately ended up in Utah,
Mm,
where my dad ended up teaching at Brigham Young University for a number of years, and then ultimately went to Northwestern. So we moved to Chicago area, and then he finally finished teaching at Northwestern University as a classical voice teacher. So I was born in Montana and then traveled around a little bit.
yeah. And how was that? I mean, being the son of a professor and being brought up around that culture, how was that for you as a child?
You know, it was interesting because obviously both my dad and my mom were very musical.
Hmm.
And so there was that pressure. I mean, my oldest brother, violin, me, cello, and
Mm,
we were taking classes and I hated the cello. And, ultimately took some piano. And I think one of my other brothers did something else. But so their focus was very much on music to some degree. But what was interesting is my dad had a real focus on just being educated. And
mm.
so, there's 5 boys in the family with 1 girl. She was the youngest. But basically, I remember my dad, and I tell people this, my dad said, "All right, boys, you will all be advanced degrees,
Mm.
and you're gonna pay for it yourself." And and that was it. And
Mm.
so, ultimately for me, I went back and forth on that. I ended up going to BYU, and I was majoring in pre-med. And ultimately, then I went and served a mission for the Latter-day Saint Church.
Mhm.
And while I was there, I was in the United States. So while I was observing, I saw all the doctors. They're never at home with their families.
Mm.
All the dentists that I saw were at home with families. They seemed to have a happy situation. And so when I got back, I decided, you know what? I'm going to switch majors. I'll go into pre-dental.
Mm.
And then I did that for 3 years.
Mm.
And then all of a sudden I was running out of money.
Mm.
And I was working a lot of jobs and so forth. And ultimately I was thinking, you know what? I really love psychology. I took a couple of psychology courses, and one in particular was business behavioral analysis type of stuff. And so I did that, and I was really tempted into going into psychology my 4th year and switching majors.
Mm.
And then I thought, okay, so I'll try this. So I'm going to apply to one university, which happened to be Northwestern because my dad worked there.
Mm.
And if I get accepted into dental school after 3 years, I'll go. If I
Mm.
don't, I'm going to switch majors.
Okay.
And sure enough, our dentist at home happened to be a Northwestern graduate also, so he put in a good word for me, and I was accepted after 3 years, so I never graduated undergraduate. I do not have an
Oh,
undergraduate degree, and
oh,
I went to dental school after my 3rd year of college, undergrad.
wow.
Yeah,
So, so psychology was a path, but dentistry turned out to be the path at that particular time for you,
at that time,
and you
and I
just
think
aligned.
yeah, and I think a lot of it, was influenced by wanting to be able to provide well for the family. There's no question that my dad pushed all of us. I mean, there's no question about that. I've got an older brother that was at Harvard Business, and I've got 2 younger brothers that are attorneys. I have one brother that did not go to college, bless his heart.
Yeah.
And he tells me the story that my dad was always on his case for not going to college. But guess who's the one that has done better than the rest of us financially? It's him.
Yeah, obviously, yeah. Now, was there any resentment towards your father? I mean, this is one of the conversations that we're going to get to regarding men in the absence of parents and fathers and things of that nature. But tell me about, was there any resentment towards your father in the way that he pushed you to excel at that degree from you or from any of the other brothers, besides the one that you mentioned that he gave him a hard time until he became the most successful?
Not really resentment. As we were growing up, we lived on an acre. And so we were out there mowing the grass. He gave us jobs. We had to work hard. And so, from a standpoint of appreciation, he really taught us the work ethic. He taught us to work hard. And, did we enjoy the musical part of it? No. Were we really resentful of that? No. I think for me, the biggest challenge was that was his life. Music was his life. And he taught voice. He was in charge of one of the top choirs there at the university. And so I didn't get a lot of time spent with my dad. And as I was going into grade school and, middle school and so forth, my friends were going with their dads to go hunting, to go fishing. And I wanted to do that. And never did. I remember one time he asked one of his associates, he says, take my son fishing because his associate liked to fish. So I went fishing with his associate once or twice, and that was it. So no resentment, but missing some things.
Yeah, yeah. And and that's always like the case, right? Because once we get older, we see that everybody has different inclinations, but you were also able to have a substitute person that took you to do some of the things that you wanted to do. So that's a
Exactly.
beautiful thing. That's a
Exactly.
beautiful thing. Question in terms of religion, right?
Uh-huh.
And because that's a big cornerstone of a lot of our Western lives, right? It's in one aspect or the other. How was growing up in the Mormon church? How was that experience? And because I know there's a big emphasis on giving back, going out, like you mentioned. Tell us a little bit about that and how that shaped your life.
I don't remember a lot of pressure when I was young. I mean, my dad had some very, strong positions of where he was in the church. So we went every Sunday and, we did all the things we were supposed to. When we moved to Chicago when I was a freshman in high school. And, and so from there, we got into an entirely different culture in the
Mm.
church. It's different Utah versus outside of Utah.
Yeah.
And and so once there, had some great teachers, was very involved, developed a really good best friend there. And at that point in time, it was fine. I appreciated what was going on. I certainly was, you know, realized, okay, I have to, and I will use that word. I've got to serve a mission because that's what I'm expected to do. And I did that. And quite frankly, that was an extremely poignant situation for me down the road.
Mm. So tell us about that. Tell us about that if you don't mind.
Oh, I don't mind. So when I was leaving on my mission at that time, the head people in the church, what they call the general authorities, the apostles, would actually come in, would go to Salt Lake City, and they would actually ordain us to be missionaries, to be elders, and to have that authority to teach and so on and so forth. And as part of that, he said to me, you know, I bless you that everything will be fine at home if you serve well.
Mm.
And a year and a half into my mission, I got a call from my mother at Christmas time saying, your dad and I are getting divorced.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what, that just threw me. It just, at that point in time, and I had done very well, and I had grown up in the leadership and so forth. But in that sense, it was like, I guess I've not served well.
Mm.
And, you know, because we were taught to believe whatever they told you was true and it was going to happen. So I had that self-doubt going on. And fortunately, there was a good friend that was also serving, and we spent a lot of time, because we were both leaders, and we spent a lot of time together. He was a bit older, and he worked with me through it. But it was still a really difficult time.
Mhm. And so how did that shake your faith, and how did that shape your spirituality as you were told something? Because we always come into that chasm, and that challenge when it comes to our spiritual lives. How did that shape you, and what transformed in you as a consequence of seeing something and not happening?
Well, and it didn't shape my immediate faith.
Uh-huh.
I still continued to do what I was doing. I still have and still hold most of those beliefs. Um, but it did ultimately show me that as I grew older and a little bit more mature and looked back on it, I realized, you know what? Sometimes they're saying things in these quote blessings that are just their opinion, and it's not true. And we shouldn't be listening all the time and expecting that to control our lives.
Mm. This is an interesting topic, and again, we don't plan exactly to get into
No.
it. Um, then what followed? Because that you mentioned in the immediacy of it all, you didn't question anything. It was, you continue to go on and you hold those values, which are very important values. So how has your spiritual life transformed over the years as a consequence of that experience, or what you just said, that you can't take everything that everybody says to you in face value like that?
Well, I think that, and later on a number of things that I won't get into, but and even now, as I have researched out, what I've realized is that for most of us, whether we're Christian, Islam, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever that happens to be, that when you get to the core teachings, you know, because I'm here in Thailand, you know, I look a lot at Buddha, and it's amazing to me how when you look at the core teachings and you see how it's been divided into about 5 main Buddhist philosophies now, and then when you see what the monks have brought into it and what the people have brought into it, it doesn't even look like
Mm.
what Buddha taught. And quite frankly, I think it's the same thing in Christianity. I can't speak to Islam because I've not studied it that much, but I understand that could be similar. But in Christianity, I've really studied this, I love theology. As I've studied that and gone back to the actual original teachings, and then I start to see historically what has happened. And, you know, where the Catholic Church came in, you had the Council of Nicaea, and you had all of these different people deciding what's going to be in the Bible and what's not going to be, and actually putting their opinion in some cases. It's like what we see today has nothing to do with what Christ actually taught in a large degree. And so my philosophy now, and like I say, I still have a very strong belief with that Mormon background or LDS background, but I look at it from the standpoint of, you know what? Everything you say, I don't agree with. I'm sorry. And do I have to follow you? Not necessarily. But there is some value there. But for me, it's like, you know what? I've got to go back to the original. I look at a lot of the Old Testament, New Testament, go back to the original Hebrew. And it's amazing to me how that changes. And, as you know, I have my own podcast, and a lot of the time we talk about all of these imprints that come into our lives that are self-defeating. And one of those, I think, really is religion. And
Mhm.
what comes to my mind is that one quote in the New Testament, "Be therefore perfect."
Mhm.
And everybody ends up developing this "I'm not good enough" concept,
Yes.
because how can I be perfect? And yet that's not what it means.
Mhm.
That the original Greek and Hebrew is "be therefore complete, even as
Yeah.
your Father in heaven is complete." And even with repentance, even with sin, all of those things have a different meaning if you get to the
Yes.
original. But it's been changed. And I think to a large degree, it was changed early historically for control,
Correct.
so that the church could control the people. And it has just continued on, and it's not really been changed.
Mhm. It's interesting that the timing of things, how the universe works in timing. Friday, a couple of days ago, I woke up in the morning and I had the urge to just listen. And I'm like you, I'm very inquisitive in terms of like, where did this come from? I spent a couple of years learning at the Kabbalah Center, understanding the original, the Aramaic. What does it mean? What does the letters truly mean? What do they realize? But I woke up on Friday and I said, and something told me, you got to go back and just look at what Jesus really said. What
Yeah.
did he really say? And I'm a big fan of the Gospel of Thomas. The
Yeah. The new
saying,
one.
the new right, the sayings of Jesus. Like what did he say? And there is so very little of that is talked about in our culture about what he really said and what he really mean. So tell me, please, because a lot of people don't. What you just said is something, in my opinion, that is not vocalized enough. From your experience, from your perspective, tell us what is that cohesiveness, that underlying threat, the message that is within all the religions. You're looking at Buddhism and Christianity. Tell us from your point of view, what is that underlying threat? What is that lesson that we really need to take from Christ and apply it into our lives?
And I think the answer to that is from the Old Testament, when he said, and I believe that Christ is Jehovah, okay,
Mhm.
but when he said, "I am that I am."
Mm.
And, when he said that, in my mind, and I used to get in trouble at church because I would ask this question in a Sunday school class. I'd say, "Okay, I have a question for you. Is there going on about you need to do this, you need to do that?" I go, "So did Christ do what he did to become Christ? Or did he do what he did because he was Christ?"
Mm.
And, and the bottom line though is, what? Our behavior, in my mind at least, is a reflection of who we are.
Mhm.
So do we work hard at becoming? Yes, and sometimes we change behavior and so forth, but the reality is that's only a step to becoming. And when we look at what Christ taught, the book of Thomas, I'm not real familiar with it, but I know that a lot of it has to do with, that personal development type of stuff.
Right.
When we look at Buddha, and his whole point was to become, to get to this point where you have become, because as you become, you naturally will then do. And if we
Yeah.
want to have a happy life, we need to become that happy individual. And quite frankly, and I know we're going to get into this topic maybe a little bit, is that who we are tends to attract others. And
Yes.
oftentimes, when we talk about challenges in our lives and relationships and so forth, it's my opinion. And again, as I've interviewed hundreds of people on this, the reality is that we tend to attract who we are inside. And if we want to change who we attract, we need to change who we are.
Who we are. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, How do you? So let's segue into that, because there's a beautiful thing that happens when you go into that path, right, and that quest to finding who I am, and but at first, it comes in the forms of a lot of challenges at first, right? And I haven't seen a religious figure that hasn't faced all those challenges yet. Jesus had to go and be tempted. The Buddha had to sit, go out in the wilderness constantly. Muhammad
Right.
had to go in the cave. Tell us about your moment in which this idea of rediscovering who you are came about. Either something that happened that was outside of your control, and we talked a little bit about that, but there's a crisis that happens, a moment that happens that moves us and propels us to search for that meaning of truly who we are. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience on that crisis?
I think probably for me, I found that over the years, I, I struggled in relationships.
Okay.
So I've had a few.
Mhm.
And And at some point in time, and I've always been extremely curious. So it's just like I don't accept anything unless I start to really read about it. And so one time I decided, I'm going to go down to Sedona,
Mhm.
Arizona.
Mhm.
I love the culture there. I love just the spirit there and everything. And once I got down there, I thought, you know what? I've got to figure out some of this stuff. And so I actually found a coach
Mhm.
that was there that approaches slightly different, which I found would be interesting. And as we went through that whole process, that was probably the beginning, and that's where I realized that yes, there were things that had been imprinted on me in the church that ultimately led me to make decisions that were not in my best interest. And the reality is that was just the beginning to realize that, you know what, I'm attracting people because of who I am. And, you talk about my dad. We didn't talk about my mom much, but
Mhm.
bless her heart, she was a wonderful mom. But, there came a point in time where I realized, okay, there's been some things there that I'm not really happy about as far
Mhm.
as things that she taught us and so forth. And so, I think ultimately that was the beginning for me. And so I started to really do that introspective work the best I could and really looking at, okay, how do I transform my life? And in that process, I still attracted people that ultimately was not in mine or their best interest. And I think what really hit me was I decided to go down to Cartagena and with Dr. Dispenza with his meditation. I'd never done any meditating, but as I was researching, is just like that meditation kept coming up. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to go learn how to do this. So I went down there and it was amazing.
Mhm.
He's an amazing guy. The week long was amazing, and he really taught how do we tap into what he calls the quantum field. I call it the eternal field,
Mhm.
but anyway, tapping into that, and as I did that, somewhere along the line, it started to affect me to the point where you know what. I've got to change my life. I've got to change my direction. I've got to change my path. And that was the beginning of ending up here in Thailand.
And everything in between. That's awesome. That's awesome. So when you started seeing the changes in you, um, what started to happen, right? Because this is and I hear popular culture talk about manifestation and talk about all that, but I'm of the belief that it started with what we were talking about, that idea of understanding who I am and changing that. So when you started changing your points, your perspective primarily, and your mental attitude towards life, what changes did you start seeing?
Well, quite frankly, there were some difficulties because in that particular relationship I was in at the time, when I started really looking at that transformation and started making those changes, all of a sudden it started to widen the gap in that relationship. And I started to observe certain situations that if I had been there earlier, I may have never gotten into that relationship. And I found myself in a very difficult situation.
So in your situation, it manifested in relationships, widening that gap. And let's talk about relationships in a broader sense for men and for
Okay.
individuals, right? Because this is something that happens a lot, and you hear happens when you begin to grow as an individual. The things that used to be no longer fit you now. What do you say to handling that the dissociation, the feelings of, oh my God, this no longer fits me. I don't know what's going to happen. How do
Oh,
you
yeah.
handle that part?
First of all, I had the realization, and I hope my brothers don't hear this podcast, but I had the realization that I basically married my mom.
Mm,
And again, I love my mom. She's passed away. She was an incredibly great mom as I was growing up. But I also recognized as I became an adult and watched her life and so on and so forth, realized that there were certainly attributes and aspects that I kept getting attracted to because that's who I had been taught to become to a large degree.
mhm.
And once I realized that and then started that transformation, all of a sudden I realized, you know what, this is not working. And I happen to be very much, left brain. I do what I do, and ultimately a few things happened to the point where it was like, you know what, I'm not doing this anymore. I have done enough transformational work, and I'm still working on it. So it's never done. But I had reached a point where I recognized, you know what, this is not who I am. This is not what I want to be. This is not what I want to experience, and I will not anymore.
Yeah, yeah. Um, as you in our previous conversation, you mentioned that in addition to this change emotionally and spiritual, and the steps that you took towards that, something also happened professionally for you. Can you speak a little bit about that and how also that propel you more into this transformation of the person that you are now?
Absolutely. What happened was I practiced dentistry for 21 years, and one day I went to the office. I started working, and I dropped instruments.
Mm,
And it's like, okay, I'm not going to do this. So I kept working, and I dropped another instrument. And my patients all wore glasses. We gave protective glasses, and I dropped an instrument and hit the glass. And my assistant looked at me, and I'm going, okay. And ultimately, what happened was over a period of years, it's interesting. Early on, when dentists were not sitting when they were standing, major back problems, major lower back problems. Well, the year after I ended up having to leave my practice because I could not practice anymore, um, I discovered that research was finally showing that now the main challenge for dentists sitting down was shoulder problems. And I developed some major shoulder issues, which also turned into some neurological issues with my hands. So I would drop instruments. And even now, when I'm working on something delicate, I shake a little bit. My hands shake. So it was just one of those things. And one day I was practicing dentistry, and the next day I'm done.
you're done.
Yeah.
Wow. And how was that? Because I mean, doing something for 20, and this is one of those things that in our culture we're always taught, to follow the prescription and select a career and do a career. You were successful at it. How was that terminality just like that? How did that affect you?
Oh, it was tough. I ultimately lost my home.
Mm,
It was just really tough. Fortunately, we had a second home, and so we moved the whole family up there. And ultimately, I went back to school. And at that point in time, I had hired some consultants for my dental practice, and I was fascinated by what they were teaching me because it wasn't just, how to do this and that in business, but there was very much that psychological human
mhm.
behavior aspect to it. And so ultimately, about 6 months later, I was down finishing some courses that I had actually paid for previously. And they said, "What are you going to do?" And I'm going, you know what? I think I want to become a consultant.
Mm,
"Oh, where are you going to go to school?" I go, "I think I'm going to go to school where you guys went to school," because it was a very specific. And so it wasn't getting an MBA. It was just getting certified in business consulting relative to that model. And
Yeah.
so that's what I did. I went back to school for a few years and ultimately started doing some consulting and worked with healthcare professionals, and then ultimately started working with other businesses, small businesses, nothing big.
That's big. And how did that new transformation, how did you take for that? How did it make you feel inside now that instead of helping people with their physical aspect, now you're helping them with the psychological aspect?
Well, and I think, I helped them business wise, but also one of the things I found was, and I would say this to some clients, you know what? You want to change your life or you want to change your business. And a lot of times I remember one particular client, I really want to spend more time with my family. I've got 2 new kids, on and on. I said, fine. So we worked on his business. But as we worked on his business, he ultimately discovered that he had more time to be with his family. And I think that goes back to my original almost became a psychologist. And I think I was attracted to that particular college because of the whole focus on human behavior, personality, communication, all of those type of things that I think are so meaningful to people.
Yeah, yeah. Um, this is so cool, right? Because I'm listening to you speak, right? And I'm listening to the different obstacles and the different challenges that came about both from the psychological and spiritual change, but also from the physical change. And a lot of people will be concerned with the trials, right? Which is one of the heroic things. What would you say to people about that are going through changes like you went through that are very challenging, very tough, earth shaking, life shattering events, losing your business, losing your relationships? What do you say to them about walking those trials and the importance of working those trials with a different perspective?
Well, and as you talk about, where was I pitched in the beginning? I really do believe that each of us are given the opportunity to face trials. And it is not that they're forced upon us. I don't believe in that. But I do believe that by choices we make and just life in general, and I believe to a large degree that we are placed here at a particular time in a particular location, knowing that we're going to experience some of that stuff because whatever we're experiencing is something that we personally need to experience. My
Yeah,
life is going to be very different than your life. But guess
absolutely.
what? You're going to experience what you need to, and I'm going to experience what I need to. Why? Because ultimately, if we can reach that point of becoming, that's part of it. So as I looked at those experiences, first of all, again, gratitude to my dad.
Mm.
He taught us, you just work hard. You just will be successful. Just do what you need to do. And so for me, it was like, all right, this happened. I'm going to do what I need to be doing. And I've got to be grateful for those things
Yeah.
that have come into my life that are blessings. And so, and as I've interviewed a lot of people again on the podcast, that's been one of the common themes is that as we look at those things that are challenging in our lives, whether we're suffering, whatever that is, the reality is if we can find just a few things to be grateful for,
Yeah.
it changes the whole concept. And then going back, religiously, and we weren't going to do this, but I did anyway.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, I love it. I love it. I love it.
you
Keep
know,
going.
here Christ suffered, not only, on the cross for our sins and so forth, but he suffered everything that we have suffered. And can you imagine for Christians, and I know it can be similar for Buddhists and Islams and so forth, realizing that what I'm suffering, he has already suffered for. So he is my friend. He's taking my hand and helping me through this. And as Buddha taught, we can overcome suffering to the point where we can truly experience a life of peace and joy. Because although we still have events that, number one, should cause us to suffer, we have developed that mindset and that ability to where if someone has the same event and they're suffering and they're a victim and how could this happen to them, others are able to look and go, okay, Life happens.
Hmm.
What do I need to do? What could I be grateful for? And how do I move forward? And it's
Right.
such an entirely different mindset.
Yeah. I have a question. This is goes with what you're saying about overcoming suffering. And I've been doing some work on this, learning about it, but maybe you have some insight into it. There's a challenge when it comes with desires, right? Because we all have desires. We have wants. We have those type of things. And I think that there's a misunderstanding between desires and attachment, right? Can you if from your point of view, I mean, now that you're well versed in this, how can someone balance that idea that it's okay to strive for things, but the attachment to the things is or the outcome, which is the Arjuna situation in the Bhagavad Gita, right? How
Right.
do you explain that to the audience or to people or to someone like me who's questioning those things?
One of the best books that I've read, and my boys actually recommended that I read it, and they read it, is a book by Eckhart Tolle
Hmm.
called A New Earth.
Hmm.
And in there, he talks about how we have become attached to things because of our ego.
Hmm.
And Buddha talks about this a lot too, that as we become attached, we think it's so important. And there's a saying that I grew up with, I have sufficient for my needs.
Hmm.
And sitting here in Thailand and watching people who are surviving literally on maybe $500 a month,
Hmm.
US dollars. All right. They're happy. They smile. They greet you with smiles and do they have their own cultural issues? Absolutely. But the
Mhm,
reality is that they have sufficient for their needs. And it was amazing for me because I was caught up in that. Believe me, I was caught up in that. The homes that I had and so on and so forth. And when I came here, my kids just laugh at me because bottom line, I purchased a home that's basically the size of a small apartment. And, and I'm going, you know what? This is sufficient
yeah,
for what I need at this point in time. And and it's been amazing to me. And every once in a while, I'll come back to the US and I still have a house there and I'll come back and it's like, oh, I miss this, I miss this. But when I get back and realize, you know what? All of that is ego. All of
yeah,
it is just having attachments to things that I think will make me happy. And what I have found with my research and discussions is that most of the time we want to feel right about ourselves. We want to
yeah,
feel good. And whether that's our opinions where we have to be right, or whether it's about wanting this car or wanting this house or wanting this or that, the reality is that doesn't make any difference. But if we keep going that way, our ego is controlling us. And at some point in time, we've got to get to the point where, oh, can I enjoy it? Absolutely. And I love it. But it
mhm,
doesn't control me. It's not
yeah,
an ego thing. It's just a blessing that I'm enjoying at this point in time. And can I do without it if I lose it? Yes, I can.
yeah, yeah. So, and that leads us to the conversation about men, right? Because this idea between ego, desire, and detachment, I think it's at the core of our Western um, current situation with the struggles of men, and then we see a lot of men attaching themselves to extremist points of views, and getting lost in the shuffle. The highest rate of suicide ever, the highest rate of mental issues ever, the highest rate of disengagement in the workforce, the highest rates of divorce. Like men are really like struggling in this particular age and this time. Um, what are some of the things in your discussions and in your research that you have found that could actually help men overcome this gap, this void that they're going through?
Well, and it actually goes to a business model that I used to follow. and and that business model is, what is it that you want to ultimately achieve?
Mm,
So if we look at life, men, what is it that you want to really achieve? Okay, so if that's what we want to do, then let's start looking back on what's our belief system? What are we doing right now? And rather than trying to start there and moving forward, I say, you know what, do this and write it down. If I want to be there, what's the previous step I need to accomplish in order to do that? And if I'm going to do that step, what's the previous accomplishment? And start working backwards. And all of a sudden, you'll get to the point where you realize that the whole factor is that core subconscious belief system that is literally controlling our lives. And when someone is willing to say, this is what I want, but I'm actually going to do what I need to do in order to achieve it, and realize that, you know what? I'm screwed up. I'm messed up. And, I'm not going to blame anyone. I'm not going to be a victim about it, but I'm going to do something about it. So immediate, there's the awareness. And then secondarily, there's the courage to be able to say, all right, I'm going to do something about it. And then the curiosity to be willing to really look into it. And everybody will find a different way. But
Yep.
the reality is if they do that, I think what they'll ultimately discover is that their life has been attracting their whole experience. And if they want to change those attractions and life experiences, they need to change themselves. And truly, as you said at the very beginning, become who you truly are. And I think that there is a spark of divinity within each one of us.
Yeah. Now, how does a man? Because again, looking at the scope, particularly here in America, right? We are so bombarded with how we should be and how you should live, and the models that are presented right now are a model of excess and what I call Kundalini area driven things. So how do you encourage a man to look for what we're both are asking, a higher level of understanding the we are, like that hey, I am point of view? How do you encourage them to go about that?
Well, I think first of all, be willing to take responsibility.
Mm,
And there's a lot that won't, but be
mhm,
willing to take responsibility and say, you know what? I am ultimately in control of my life, and what I'm experiencing, I cannot be a victim for. I'm going to take responsibility for. Therefore, what do I need to do? I think that's the first step. And then, depending, as I talk to different people, it's like the reason I have so many podcasts and talk to different people with different opinions is because everyone is going to resonate with something different.
yes.
So I would say, you know what? Go out, research, get that curiosity, start to really research, listen to podcasts, watch some YouTube, whatever that happens to be, go to workshops, seminars, and discover what it is that makes a difference for you.
Yeah.
For instance, being in the networking group that I was in and so forth, oh, Tony Robbins, Tony Robbins, Tony Robbins. I think he says some wonderful things, but did I ever have any desire? No.
Mm,
But then all of a sudden, here's, Joe Dispenza with meditation, and something inside just said,
mm,
go. And
mm,
so I think what we need to do is recognize that as those thoughts come into our minds, we need to look at, all right, is that a thought that really resonates with my values, with my inner
mm,
self, with who I really, truly am? And if it does, great. And if it doesn't, then ignore it and find a different path, because everyone will find a different path to help them, and ultimately find a different individual coach, mentor,
mhm.
whatever that is, to help them to do that. And I really do believe that you need that. You need to find someone that you can
Yes.
trust, that is in a position, and you can observe their lives to say that, you know what, that's where I want to be.
Mhm.
And therefore, I need some help and mentorship.
Yeah. You said something beautiful right now, and it was so honest because I saw your body change, and it was about listening to that thing inside you, when you gave the example of Tony Robbins versus Joe Dispenza, there was this thing that it was like, yes, this is the thing for me. How does a person recognize that? I know that you're very left brain, but and that's something that is very emotional and very internal. How does someone recognizes and listens to that voice, that intuition, like you just did?
And first of all, I really believe in meditation.
Okay.
I think that, and learn how to do it however you're going to learn how to do it. But to me, meditation is you're able to access that eternal universe, that eternal energy, all of that type of thing. And as you do that, thoughts will start to come up that you've never really had before. Or imprints will start to come up that have caused emotions that you'll be able to recognize, wow, that's not really who I am. So I think it's understanding, number one, that we really do have that divinity within us. I am a firm believer on that. And if we can accept that, then realize that we can tap into that and tap into that intuition. And as hey, we're going to make mistakes. We listen to this, we do it. Oh, that wasn't right. And we do it and do it. And all of a sudden we're going to gain that confidence that, you know what, this is truly intuition that I need to listen to and go forward with it.
Now, you've been in business most of your life, and in business, sometimes this topic gets a little bit tabooish. How would you advise business owners and people that are looking to start a business to, in addition to tap into the organizing aspect of the business, but also to tap into this? How would you advise them to use that in running a successful business?
Well, I think there's a there's a balance that has to be there, because what I have seen is a lot, and I work mainly with small businesses. So as I've seen, someone comes up with this great idea. That in fact, my boys came up with a great idea. Two of my sons decided to go into business together, in addition to what they're already doing, which they have very successful careers. And so they started this little business on the side, and it didn't work. And what I find is that so often we think this is what people need. Oh, they need this, they need that, they need this. When in fact, we never take the time to research and to go out and find out what is it that they not only need, but what is it that they want. And so often people start these small businesses because they think that people want and need this, when in reality, they don't. And so you have to do that research. You have to do, the surveys, all of that type of thing, to find out how badly is this wanted, what's my competition, and do I have sufficient funds to stay open for 2 to 3 years, because that's what it's going to take in normal cases, in order to be able to get to the point where I'm making a profit.
Yeah. So as we come to the end of our conversation, right? You lived a full life. You've done so many things. You have overcome so many challenges to really find your what we call your essence, and living from that essence. Now you're podcasting, you're listening to people, you're sharing their thoughts, their ideas, and everything. At this stage in your life, what is that goal that you have? What is that target, like you mentioned, find a goal and go after it? What is that now? What is it that drives you at this stage in life?
Well, and I have a wonderful relationship, so that's the other thing that we didn't talk about. But
Oh, yes,
I
yes.
I think, excuse me, I think the drive for me is really what changed in my podcast. My podcast years ago was, business tips and trends, and
Mhm.
at some point in time, it's like, you know what? I want to make a difference in people's lives.
Mm.
What can I do to serve? And so I changed the whole podcast to Inspire Vision, Making a Difference. And if you ask me what my purpose is now, and sometimes it's frustrating here in Thailand because I don't speak the language. And so, it's not as easy. But every once in a while, I'm able, and real quick, do I still have time, or do we need
Yeah,
to
no, no,
finish?
let's keep going. Let's keep going.
When I was living in one particular place, I was trying to work on visas and all of this type of stuff, and I met a young lady came in at the visa place that spoke English, and she said, "Look, I speak English. What can I do to help you?" And I go, "Well, here's what we're trying to do," and so on and so forth. And I mentioned I had a podcast. She said, "Oh, I would really love to hear that." So she got the link and so forth. Well, I moved. I came down here where I'm at now. And every once in a while she'd send me a message saying, "Man, I really appreciated that podcast." And I thought, well, that's great. Well, ultimately, we've stayed in touch,
Uh-huh.
and she's just a sweet lady. She's got a couple of young kids. And she wrote me a letter one time, a message, and she said, "You'll have no idea what your podcasts have done for me. The messages that are there," and she would call and ask questions, and I would give her some thoughts. And she said, "It has changed my life.
Mm.
Thank you so much."
Wow.
And you know what? We don't get that very often. And maybe that's one in the, 20 years that I've experienced that. But the reality is for me, and I think if we can all get to the point where how do I make a difference? And it isn't with the millions, it isn't with the hundreds of thousands, it isn't even with the thousands. It's just with that one person that if you can make a difference in their lives, even if it's a smile, a hug, maybe, a gift, whatever that happens to be, if you can do that, who knows down the road what that's going to do for generations.
Yeah. Wow, that is just beautifully said. I mean, there's ultimately that is the word of the gospels, right? To
It
arrive at
really
that point.
is.
To
Oh,
arrive
yeah.
at that point.
Absolutely. To love God and to love others. And then if that's truly who you are, then your actions and your behavior will merely reflect that.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Doug, I think that right there is a perfect ending for this part of the conversation because I think and I feel it in here that we're going to have to continue to talk about this because I think that there's some ideas and some things in there that I would love to ask you more questions and go back and forth on some ideas because it's so lovely to see and amazing to see how you have arrived at that conclusion through a life and have lived a full life driven goal listening to the intuition and then finding yourself in a point of expression which is one of the most beautiful things that I've seen in a long time. So
Well, and I'm still on that soul quest. I don't
yes,
think
you
it.
are.
I don't think it ever stops. I think it's just a continuous thing. That, given our experiences and situation, we need to keep working on it. So I appreciate what you do with that.
Oh,
I think
thank you.
that's fantastic.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So how do we find you? Where do people go to get in touch with you? Where people go to listen to your podcast? How do they find you?
Okay, so the podcast is Inspire Vision Podcast.
Mhm.
And my website is inspirevisionpodcast.com. And all of the shows are right there. They're both, or, if they want to do it with their audio only, it's on every major podcast site there. And I write a few blogs every once in a while that are on my website. So that's it. I stopped doing the coaching and all of that stuff a while ago. And if I do it, it's because I want to, and I don't charge for it.
Mm.
If someone needs some help. So the reality is, come listen to my podcast.
Thank you for listening to the ASQ podcast. Remember to lead your life, shape your culture, begin within. Subscribe now and join the movement.